So I've given everybody a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint that you've got is basically the wrap-up notes for Chapter 5. So the only notes you'll really need to focus on today is what's in the handout in front of you. You don't need really to take out your earlier PowerPoint from during the week. The notes that I've given you here, I just want to spend a little time kind of wrapping things up. And we're going to talk about today, we talked about the end of the war yesterday and the Treaty of Paris. We're going to talk today about how the war transformed America, what the revolution did to transform America. And occasionally at the end of the week, if we have not gotten all the way through the thick packet that I give you on Monday, the thick PowerPoint that we started with, I will put together a wrap-up section, which is basically going to be a quick tutorial on the topics that we need to cover. So for this, Chapter 5, let's talk about the American Revolution. You won't really need to write a lot today, but if I do put something on the board in addition to what's up there right now, please add to it. But these effectively are our notes for today. Let's really quickly, an overview. I got 3 quick bullet points here. The revolution was an armed conflict between nations, but it was also a political and a social revolution. It upended politics and it upended society, and it actually reshaped American society. It wasn't just a war. It wasn't just a military engagement. The term revolution, lowercase r, the term revolution means a momentous change. And the American Revolution, capital R, was the military part of it, but there was a revolution in society as well that transcended military. So you had a political revolution and a social revolution, and we'll talk about that today. Something I want you to be thinking about today: how does the revolution change political and social structures in the United States? After the war, how is the United States going to be different because of the outcome of the revolution? We're going to key in on 3 groups today. We're going to look at the effects the revolution had on American women. We're going to look at the effects the revolution had on everyday Americans, men and women. We're going to look at the effects the revolution had on African Americans, both free and enslaved African Americans, and we're going to look at the effect that the revolution had on American Indians, Native Americans. But one at a time, let's take a peek here. Let's talk about the political changes first off on page 3. The major political change is going to be a shift from a monarchy to republicanism. And I don't mean republicanism, the political party. The meaning of the term republican is a form of government in which people elect their leaders. So the huge shift politically is an adaptation by Americans of a Republican ideology. In other words, shifting from a monarchy, which is rule that's basically by a king or ruled by a family, and that rule is passed on from generation to generation automatically. Kings aren't elected. Kings aren't chosen by the people. King, remember divine right? Okay, divine right determines who's king, who's queen. Well, there's going to be a shift in America from a monarchy to republicanism. A republican form of government is one in which we all get to choose the leaders. We elect leaders to make decisions for us. So that's going to be the huge shift, one from a monarchy to republican. The other political change is going to be suffrage rights are going to expand for white males. The group that's going to be affected largely by suffrage rights as a result of the revolution is going to be white males. Before the revolution, in most colonies, in most states, you had to be a property owner to vote. You had to be white, you had to be a property owner, and you had to be typically over the age of 21. Well, after the revolution, suffrage rights are going to expand, and many places are going to reduce or eliminate totally the property ownership requirement. So suffrage rights are going to expand to include more white males. The term suffrage, everybody clear on that term? We talk about suffrage rights, we're talking about voting rights. Voting rights. As I said, property requirements to vote were lowered or removed, and the Republican ideology is different from a monarchy. Katie, how? The thought-provoking question here, how does Republican ideology differ from a monarchy? What would the big difference be between those two types of government?
So people get to choose who control them.
You get to choose. People get to choose in a Republican form of government, and that today is our form of government. We do not live in a pure democracy. We have a Republican form of government in which we elect leaders to make decisions for us. And that is important. That was one of the political changes as a result of the revolution. Good? All right. Political changes. Let's take a look at a video clip on this topic.
By their very nature, revolutions are transformational events historically. In the context of the American Revolution, the ideals of liberty and equality and freedom, by their very nature, revolutions are transformational events historically. In the context of the American Revolution, the ideals of liberty and equality and freedom that were directed at the British government soon helped transform people's ideals about social and economic and political life in the new United States. In particular, one result of the revolution was the transformation of political engagement. That is, more and more of the states in the new United States began eliminating or reducing the property requirements for voting and holding office. At the same time, religious practices were changed as a result of the revolution. That is, by the end of the revolution and in the late 18th century, virtually all states eliminated official religions like the Anglican religion in Virginia. Taken together, the American Revolution then was much more than a political and military event. It was a transformational force in changing the nature of American society and politics, and indeed the American dream.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Let's find it here quickly. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the power shift between the states and the national government. This is going to be a huge result. There was, when the Americans win the war, there was a fear of a restored monarchy leading to power being vested in the states. So when the war is won, to make sure that a monarchy will not come back into power, the American political leaders at the time took steps to make sure that where government grants power, it is granted to the states and not to a strong national government. This is one reason that the Articles of Confederation, our country's first constitution, was not really able to serve the country's need because it did not give the federal government too much what? Too much power. The federal government couldn't collect taxes under the Articles. The federal government could not, the federal government only had one branch of government. There was no court system. The federal government could not tax. There was tons of things that the government was intentionally left weakened to do. And this is because Americans after the war feared, unless they made sure that the government and the power was vested in the individual states, they were worried about the monarchy returning. All right? So states write new constitutions with more elected positions. In other words, states during and after the revolution are going to be sure to write constitutions, and each of the state constitutions are going to spell out very, very plainly the rights of the people and the limits on the power of the government. This is intentional. It's designed to make sure that people's rights are written down, and it's designed to make sure that government power is limited, especially the national government, especially the federal government. The United States, after the war, does not want to have to worry about 5 years, 10 years down the road having to entertain the possibility of another king coming to power, another tyrant, another ruler with absolute control. So this is why the power was granted primarily in government to the individual states. State government in the aftermath of the war is going to be the most powerful government. You're going to have 13 states, and after the war, you're going to have basically 13. I use the analogy because of the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, because our national government didn't have a lot of power. You really got 13 states kind of rowing their own boat, doing their own thing. They were united in the sense that we were free from England, but there was nothing that really united the states because they each had 13 different forms of state governments. The colonists then preferred state power over national power because they knew full well that their rights had been violated and their rights had been abused by a king, by a monarchy in England 3,000 miles away. So when the first Constitution is written, the Articles of Confederation, it was left intentionally weak to not give government too much power. Too much power. It gave power to the people in the individual states and not to the national government. Okay? Let's take a peek at separation of church and state. This is another byproduct of the American Revolution. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is really important. 1786, Thomas Jefferson and Virginia passed a law called the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom basically guaranteed separation of church and state. It said that the government could not compel people to practice a particular religion. It said that the government could not compel people to attend church services. It said the government could not compel residents to practice a religion if they chose not to. So this Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, 1786, was a landmark, meaning it was very, very pivotal in establishing the very important, even to this day, belief that Americans have a freedom of religion. We do not have a state-sanctioned religion. The government cannot tell you that you have to worship as a Catholic, or as a Jew, or as a Muslim, or as a Baptist. That is entirely up to us. First Amendment of our Constitution pretty much guarantees freedom of religion. To include, you can choose any religion you want, you can practice any religion you want, but you can also choose not to practice a religion. That was instituted during the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And we'll also see that in the First Amendment to the Constitution spelled out. First Amendment, 5 protections. The first one, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, okay? Freedom of the press, all right? The country will begin to promote religious freedom for all people. It will begin to promote religious freedom for all people. And again, separation of church and state is important because the colonists under the king, oftentimes, not only were you forced in many states to, or pressured in many states to adhere to a specific religious belief under the king, but you also had to pay taxes to those churches. Churches were often taxpayer funded. And that is going to cease with the new America after the Revolution. And that will continue today. Our tax dollars do not fund. Now, we can donate individually to churches and church groups, and Americans are very generous, but the government cannot compel you to pay tax dollars to religious organizations. It's simply not done. It's not legal under our Constitution. Separation of church and state. Does everybody understand what that means? Under separation of church and state, does that mean that you can't talk about God in a public school? As a public high school teacher, does church and state prohibit the discussion of religious matters in school? No. No, absolutely not. Nowhere in the Constitution, nor nowhere in our Bill of Rights does it prevent people in a public forum from practicing or talking or discussing religion. But what it does prevent is the government cannot compel people to practice a particular religion. Okay? If Lizzie came in here today and had a cross on or a Star of David, let's say you had a Star of David, which is a symbol of the Hebrew faith, and I, being Catholic, let's say I was an ornery old dude, and I didn't like the fact that you were wearing the Star of David. Would I have the right to say to Lizzie, she's not, I don't want her wearing her religious symbol in my classroom? Would I have that right? Would I be violating her rights and telling her to take that off? Yeah. So freedom of, or separation of church and state does not mean that religion can't be discussed. It cannot mean that religion can't be taught. It just means that government cannot compel people to practice a particular faith. Understood? All right, good. Next up, let's look at social changes for African Americans. Social changes for African Americans. I think I have a video clip on this. I want to make sure. Let's double check. Okay. Guys, I'm going quick. I want to get through this. If you have any questions, though, don't be shy. All right? I don't have to talk for 40 minutes. You guys can.
It's very important to appreciate the effects of the American Revolution on three groups within the larger American society. First, African Americans. The British Army, at the beginning of the Revolution, announced that any enslaved Americans who agreed to join the ranks of the British Army or the British Navy would gain their freedom thereby. As a result, some 20,000 African American slaves were able to gain their freedom by joining the British side during the Revolution. At the same time, tens of thousands of enslaved African Americans took advantage of the turmoil generated by the revolutionary fighting, the armies moving back and forth, to gain their freedom. They literally escaped. So for them, the revolution was truly a social revolution. At the same time, Native Americans also experienced great transformations. Indian tribes joined each side of the Revolutionary War. And as a result, by the end of the war, with the Americans winning, those Indians who fought for the British were greatly discriminated against. In addition, the promises made by the American side during the Revolution quickly were abandoned after the Revolution, as American whites aggressively moved into Indian lands. Women, too, of course, hoped that the American Revolution would be a social transformation for them as well. Abigail Adams, the formidable spouse of John Adams, the revolutionary leader, urged her husband and other founding fathers to allow women to exercise greater independence and opportunity in post-revolutionary America.
Do any of you recall from the reading what Abigail Adams' three-word sentence was to her husband as the men begin to draft the Declaration of Independence? From Boston, she wrote her husband and she told him and the people who were writing the Declaration, rather, three words of advice. Actually, it was a three-word demand. She told her husband to remember the ladies, that this new republic that they were creating, that this new nation is one that has to remember that women who had no rights, no marriage rights, no property rights, no ownership rights. She wasn't really talking about voting rights when she said that, but she was imploring her husband to remember that half of the nation was women. Okay? But women will not see a lot of change immediately after the American Revolution. Women's lives will not be noticeably different, and we'll see why in a moment.
Last, however, husband John, as well as Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers, had no interest in supporting a gender revolution as a result of America gaining its independence.
Okay, let us take a peek at the balance of the slideshow. We should be able to get through this in the time that we have. In the North after the war, we are going to see northern states immediately. If they weren't on track, some were on track to do it before the war, but northern states begin to free enslaved blacks after the war. Northern states begin to free enslaved blacks. Southern states, however, as we know, are going to refuse. The institution of slavery was so ingrained in every southern state that whites were simply not going to diminish. Whites were not going to relinquish, rather, the benefits that their southern society enjoyed due to human bondage. So southern states are refusing to free slaves. The differences between the two, northern states and southern states, and this is important. I want an alarm to go off in your head when you hear this. Northern states and southern states after the war are going to start to, because northern states are freeing slaves in large numbers, Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, because northern states are freeing slaves and southern states are not, we're starting to see the developing polarization between northern states and southern states. This is where, right after the war, we're going to start to see the growth of what we call sectionalism. Two sections of the United States, one slave-free, no slavery in the North, one where slavery is not only practiced, but it is an ingrained part of American life in the American South. Palin.
Is there like a war fought later on?
The war that will be fought to end slavery will be the American Civil War. That will be fought in 1861. We'll get to that mid-year. Okay? All right? Capiche, questions on slavery and the social changes related to Americans. Okay? More to come on that, I'm sure. Changes for women. Okay? Women took on non-traditional roles during the war. Your book referenced a couple of them. Molly Pitcher was a woman whose husband was a soldier. She aided her husband at the front line by basically coming and operating cannons when her husband and other men were injured. There are a couple of women who masqueraded as men during the American Revolution in order to fight, in order to serve the colonies, in order to serve the United States. But generally speaking, women are not going to serve as soldiers, but they are going to take on non-traditional roles during the fighting. They're going to have to do all the things on the home front that men and boys and husbands and sons do when they are home. They're going to have to run the farms. They're going to have to run the businesses. They're going to have to make sure that the budget is in order. They're going to have to make sure that the crops have been planted and harvested. So women are going to take on non-traditional roles during the war. And don't shoot the messenger here, ladies. But after the war, when the soldiers came home and the United States is victorious, women were expected to do what? Go back to the traditional female roles of caregiver, of preparing meals, of basically handling the domestic front. Women were not, after the war, going to be, they're not going to be encouraged to continue these non-traditional roles. Now, that'll change. We're going to see steady progress after the war for women, but immediate aftermath of the war, women are still relegated to the domestic sphere. And the domestic sphere is a kind of a euphemism for what? If women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, what are we saying? The home. And tasks associated with either child rearing, homekeeping, meal preparation, laundry, supporting the family. Not saying those are not valuable, but those are the only things that the women were really encouraged and allowed to participate in. Okay? No significant changes in legal status or political status will happen to American women, free, black, or white, after the war. No significant changes. So legally, women are still not going to be able to own their own property if they're married. Alyssa, if you were married as a free woman in 1790 and you had property that came into a marriage, let's say you're a free woman, you marry, you're a single woman, you marry, and you have property entering the marriage. The moment she says, I do, and you may kiss the husband, legally her property becomes what? The property of the husband. So legally, women were in kind of the twilight zone after the war also. Also, political status, they had no real political power. Women were not allowed to vote. Even in northern states, women were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to hold office. And in most places, women, it will be very, very frowned upon for women to even engage in political discussion. Political discussion was considered a sphere for males. But we're going to see gradually after the war that's going to change. It won't happen overnight. It's not going to be boom, boom, but overnight or gradually we're going to see some changes. Native Americans. Let's wrap up with our discussion of Native Americans. The revolution, and I've stressed this a lot the last couple of weeks, revolution had a catastrophic effect on Native Americans, regardless of which side they supported, and they supported both sides. They would face land seizures, they would face violation of treaties, they would face being pushed off their lands, they would face hostile American settlers moving west, wanting to cash in after the war on the availability of, and I use this term loosely, American settlers wanted to cash in on the availability now of free land that England had to relinquish. So Native Americans are, the outcome of the war for them is probably going to be the worst outcome of the three groups that we talked about. American women had no political rights or they had no social rights really before the war. Okay, African Americans who were free, okay, who were free before the war will continue to be free and they'll continue to have opportunities. But Native Americans who fought on both sides during the war, regardless of who they fought for, we're going to see their world and their civilization literally collapse. It's going to be, a better word would probably be eroded. Their land, their culture, their way of life, as more and more Americans move west, we're going to see the erosion of Native American culture. Gradual, very, very swift in the area, in the time, in the post-American Revolution. So to recap, we've talked about three major groups today after we've talked about the political and the social changes of the revolution. We talked about the Republican ideology coming into play, replacing what ideology? The monarchy. And then we're looking at how American blacks, Native Americans, and how American women are going to be adversely affected. All these ways and more are we going to see. Long-term effects on African Americans. You asked the question, who's poor? You asked the question. The revolution is, and guys, this is vital. Make a mental note on this. The revolution sparked early movements toward emancipation in the North. How can you possibly, I want you to think about something. The Declaration of Independence begins by saying that every human being is endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And those rights are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to pursue happiness. Very first paragraph of the Declaration would state that. Go. African Americans are quick. Free blacks in the North and slaves in the South are quick to seize on that statement in the Declaration that says all people are born with inalienable rights, rights to life, liberty, and to pursue happiness. And yet, as our country is being born in 1776, that whole block of people, matter of fact, they weren't considered people, they were considered what? Property. That whole group of people were left out of that equation. So the revolution is going to spark an early movement toward emancipation, meaning the freedom of slaves. It will. The revolution and the the efforts of African Americans will set the stage for future abolitionist movements. Okay, there's going to be a quick, really quick emergence in the North of a small group of people who are going to immediately support abolition, the movement to ban slavery, the movement to outlaw slavery. How does the revolution lay the groundwork for this? Well, the revolution lays the groundwork because African Americans, many of them who fought in the revolution, many who died in the revolution, are going to say, listen to this, if we are fighting for our freedom as a nation from a king, if we think the king is ruling over us, let me just finish this point. If we think the king is ruling over us and is unjust to us because of how he treats us as English citizens, African Americans are saying, why in the world are we tolerating being treated like second-rate citizens here in our own country? More on that next week. Please read chapter 6 for Monday.